Thank you for joining us for this program, the 10th program of Look Before You Speak, and appreciate MCAT helping and producing this program. And the program, the concept is that commercial television focuses on objects between 1 and 2 seconds on commercial television. And we wanted to take the opportunity to show and artwork for a longer amount of time and really talk about it and discuss it and invite people in who are scholars, writers, administrators who have a strong opinion about the value of artwork and really look at the artwork and talk about it. Today we have a very special guest, Shalene Valenzuela, who's the director of the Clay Studio here in Missoula. And this Clay Studio has been going for quite a few years, and I think Shalene can talk about that a little bit. But it's we're just very thankful that the studio's here in Missoula and contributing culturally to the cultural integrity of the community. And so anyway, she's brought some images in, but this is Shalene, and she's going to talk a little bit about the Clay Studio.
So the Clay Studio Missoula is a 501c3 nonprofit. The Clay Studio has been around for about 18 years, actually. Old enough to vote.
That's great.
And it started as just a little pottery in a garage. And really, they just started having classes and moved. And right now, we are in the third and final location we're going to be in, which is on Hawthorne Street.
And it has a pretty vibrant residency program.
Yes, definitely. And so that's one facet of the programming there. We also have classes, and then we rent space to community members to come in and work in clay.
Well, Missoula is really fortunate, and the residency programs had a tremendous impact on bringing artists into the cultural fabric of Missoula, and we've been very fortunate to have a lot of these folks here.
Yeah, and actually I started as an artist in residence there. I was the first artist in residence, long-term artist in residence in the current location, which is when we started to have programming that invited for people up to 2 years to come and be artists in residence at the Clay Studio.
That's great. And then so you eventually became director. And so how do people apply and make themselves aware and available, I guess?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So we do have an application process, and it's so it's only open once a year, and it's usually the second or the first Thursday in April. And we'll get applications for long-term residencies, short-term residencies. We started developing this program just because we want to invite people to come and work in the space. We also have a really short residency that somebody can do for a month or less. That's called our community residency, and they work in the community space with the community artists. They're there renting space. So it's a really great way to get people who are just here for a very short time really entrenched in our community and really focused and working alongside them. And
you not only have this educational programs and the residency program, but you also have a gallery where you feature work on a monthly basis?
Yeah. So basically we have rotating shows on a monthly basis, except for January, which we take the month off. And the shows can range to group exhibitions. We have an annual juried exhibition, and the theme tends to change every year. And we also feature solo exhibitions of our long-term artists in residence around the time that they complete their residency.
Well, it's really been a wonderful addition in 18 years and drawn attention to a lot of the regional strength of clay and ceramics and the language surrounding ceramics. And you brought some images in today.
Yes, I did.
Okay, great.
I believe I was asked to do that.
Yeah, all right. So we're looking at...
this is a work by Allison Ranches.
Allison Ranches.
Yes. And she was an artist in residence at the Clay Studio Missoula. Oh goodness, I should have memorized these dates. But She finished about 3 or 4 years ago, and she has her own studio at her home. And as she works with making these slip cast forms, and as you can see, there's so much geometry and consistency in the forms. But what I think is really elegant about her pieces is the fact that she integrates these geometric forms with these patterns that glaze moves and fluxes as it goes through the firing process. And then so there's sort of this liveliness in the lines that she creates as she applies those lines. The glaze is like in this linear pattern, but the firing process allows it to move around. So it gives this fluidity to these very like rigid forms. And so there's this like sort of play and contradiction in that. And
there is a great deal of there's a historical reference here in the whole movement out of the 70s of pattern and design. And these forms are really amazing. Yeah, it was like really, really interesting because she, with slip casting, one thing you have to do with slip casting, I don't know if you're so aware of the process, and I can explain it technically for everybody who doesn't know about it. And I employ slip casting in my work as well. So basically, you'll make a plaster mold out of an original object, and I do appliances and all this different stuff. But Allie makes her own forms, and then so she's able to make multiples of these. She'll make a plaster mold of it, and then basically what is put in that mold is a liquefied clay body referred to as slip. And so and that has to be timed. It's basically the same concept of one of those hollow chocolate Easter bunnies where you sort of break open and there's this empty middle. And these forms are pretty much the same. And so I know a little bit about porcelain, but it provides a lightweight, strong, and allows you to create multiples. Exactly. Yeah. And then so you're able to do that. And then and precision is another thing too, because you want to be able to drain these molds. So it was really great in her process. I remember I had made a mold years ago as a resident of this like timer, and I'd left it in the studio. And as she was a resident there, she'd be winding up this timer that had been in a mold and to use to time draining her molds. And so just interesting to see how these different artists pass on these different things. So as a director, do you also see yourself as a technical advisor in situations for some of the residents? It really varies. Essentially, it depends on what processes they are working in. A lot of them come to us directly from graduate program, or they just finished a BFA program. And I do enjoy that exchange between residents when they have a question or an issue in their work and want to discuss that. A lot of residency programs, we're structured so they get that free time to work outside of the academic setting. And so they don't, because a lot of these people are getting out of programs, they're just like, okay, I need some time for my work to breathe. But I find it invigorating to be able to have these discussions with artists and residents, and always enjoy that and invite that. I've noticed since knowing quite a few of the residents over the years that it always seems like there's an independence and also a real, most of the residents are very driven in what their ideas are and pursuing their ideas. And I think it's really reflects positively on the clay studio. Yeah, for sure. Well, let's look at another image if you're up for it. Sure. Okay. I brought in 6. So. Okay, that's great. Wow. And so this is Cortney Murphy. She was an artist in residence. She finished a little over 2 years ago. She now currently has a studio in the Brunswick building, and actually I share space with her in the Brunswick building. She is a functional potter. She
Basically, she's done residencies at the Archie Bray Foundation, a little bit at the Red Lodge Clay Center. She's been all over the place. And she makes these really sort of approachable yet elegant forms that are meant to be everyday use in the home, and sort of these pleasing objects that will integrate into your life. And also in these, there's this warmness to it, but also a playfulness in the designs. She's also always looking at line and shape and contour and how to play with that in different ways that creates pattern, but also like sort of this order, but in playfulness in that pattern.
Yeah, I also, when I see this work, I think she's very much a colorist too. And she has a sensitivity about color and design and utility. Utility is a strong driver in her work, isn't it?
Yeah, for certain. And the thing is, there's also, I mean, just knowing her as a person, she has a great appreciation for food, beverages, and how you approach that, and what good food is, and what a good beverage is. And like that's sort of actually knowing that about her personally, that comes through in her functional work for certain.
And she is also very prolific.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So,
Very hard worker.
yeah. Well, let's look at another image if you're.
This is Casey Zablocki. He was our wood fire resident and finished a little over a year ago. And all these people I'm talking about are people who are in the Missoula area, and it's sort of a reflection on like how Missoula kind of has drawn people into the area that are working professionally in clay, and a lot of artists and residents have like sort of chosen to stay around Missoula and the surrounding area. And Casey came to us just pretty much doing a lot of wood-fired work, and he started focusing near the end of his residency on these furniture forms that he's been exploring. So it's very large-scale work that serves a function and a purpose, but from a very like sculptural, raw aesthetic. And then in the background, you'll see one of like sort of this concept drawing of one of these coffee table pieces that he had put together for the show as well. And right now he is working in Missoula and creating a body of work with some large-scale forms that he's going to be firing in the Clay Studio on Agama next month that are going to be featured in a show, I believe, at La Petite in December, where he'll have furnishings and tables and whatnot.
And these are all wood-fired?
These are actually not. He decided to work with the slip that
wow,
you can't.
These are slip?
Well, it's basically the slip. So there's different. Slip just generally refers to a liquefied clay body. So what he did is he hand built these, and he created this slip that sort of is this very black, dense slip with a sort of sheen on it. So it's sort of like a. It goes on top of the work and gives it this sort of glazed but raw appearance. And so these are actually fired in a gas reduction kiln.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he also does more earthenware?
He actually works more so in high fire, so that's generally in that work, and then also his wood fire work.
Yeah.
Earthenware is all low fire, so
yeah.
basically you're looking at like under 2,000 degrees.
You brought in really a variety of different aesthetics and sensibilities and approaches, yet all still working with clay.
Yeah.
And how does that work? The chemistry of all of these people in these different approaches, is it like maybe the first time that some of them have been thrown in together? Like,
well, I think a lot of them, if they've gone through a program, because a lot of our artists and residents have gone through BFA and MFA programs, they're exposed to working in different ways. So when Casey came to us, for example, he in his portfolio had some like actual porcelain slip cast works, but they didn't look like it. He had just made molds of these objects that looked really rough, but he had made these
Yeah.
slip cast forms out of them. So you basically get people who they've started to get their narrative down, their dialogue, their aesthetic. And so in the residency program, it's kind of like that's what we're looking for, is somebody who has their narrative sort of developed and their way of working developed and a solid body of work.
And a seriousness about continuing and working.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
that's really obvious.
Yeah.
So, no, that's wonderful. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
And another thing that it's been so enriching to Montana as well. You have the Archie Bray Foundation that established for 65 years. That there's all this, Helena is not that big of a place, but you have this core of clay and all the ceramic work going on around there, and artists choosing to stay there and stay on and develop their studios. And so that sort of starts overflowing into these different areas, and with the university and then with the clay studio here, that's sort of creating another little epicenter.
Sure. And I think
Montana.
it's, you think of, the legacy of Rudy Audio and Rudy living here for years, and
Exactly.
and the impact of the University of Montana. And I think for years, certainly before the clay studio, many artists graduated and then went out to teach in the hinterlands. So a lot of times we'd never see them before. And I think the clay studios allowed another social platform, for the clay village to continue to meet and grow and develop.
And then you also see a lot of the students from the university kind of sticking around and doing different things in town. And so that's even becoming more energized as well.
Well, let's look at another image.
Okay. This is Eva Champagne. She actually went to the University of Montana as a graduate student, and she is currently living down the Bitterroot, and she was an artist in residence several years ago at the Clay Studio Missoula. She creates these organic forms, which this piece is in a show that's currently up at the Clay Studio right now called Animal, Vegetable, Mineral. And then when I had sort of created the concept for this show, it must have been buried in my mind somewhere, but she had a show years ago called Animal, Vegetable, Mineral. And so of course she was naturally one of the people who I immediately thought of to invite to the show. And basically she's dealing with these sort of a lot of her work has to do with organic forms and natural forms, and bringing these together and in creating these new environments with them, along with her firing techniques and her layers of different earth-based tones, and bringing in colors that reflect something from the natural world.
And there's a reference here to a vessel.
Exactly.
But it's also really sculptural. It's really wonderful.
And the thing is, it's you have this very sort of static form on the bottom, this very solid base, and then yet the glaze pattern with the blue flowing out, and then sort of these porcelain ventricles, sort of bursting
flower-like
out from
natural.
Sort of blooming out from that grounded form.
It's really fantastic.
Yeah.
And different sculpturally than, say, Zach. This really has a light hand about it.
Oh, Casey, you're talking about?
Yeah, Casey.
Oh, yeah, I was like, Zach.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, what am
Zach?
I talking about?
But
I'm sorry.
Oh no, that's fine. I thought you were meaning Zootown Art Center. I'm like,
no,
sculpture's there right now.
No. Sorry about that.
But even though it has a heaviness, there's this sort of lightness to that as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of her history, she grew up in Hong Kong. She's traveled around the world. She lived in the Virgin Islands for a while. So a lot of this, you can sort of, just from her history of where she's lived and where she's traveled.
She's absorbed a lot of these environments that she's been in. Yeah.
And so that really is reflected in the forms that she makes.
Let's look at another image.
Okay.
These are fun.
So this is Phil Mon. He is a potter in Florence, and he was not an artist in residence at the Clay Studio, but I wanted to bring his work in because he was so integral to a lot of aspects of the Clay Studio. He was one of the people I first connected with when I was an artist in residence there. And his work has changed. Like, he's always had this sort of like his forms that you can see here in the teapot. There's sort of these squat forms that are very expressive and have a certain look to them. But his surface, the way he's approached his work and the surfaces has like vastly changed from when I first was introduced to him. And he sort of like refined this technique. He started to work with in fire with a potter in Helena named George McCauley. And so Phil was doing a lot of high fire, wood fire work, which is generally what wood fire work, you take it to a very high temperature, about cone 10 or higher. And then with Phil, he started working with George and firing with him, and he built a wood kiln that he does low fire work in. So the colors are kept intact with the slips, and then and so you kind of have that like rawness and roughness of atmospheric firing with wood, and sort of that ashiness and the
So there's a
darkness to it.
reduction in this with, these aren't raku,
No,
but
no.
there's the dark areas are from a reduction with the wood. Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's like
really
different
nice.
parts of the kiln. And so, but since it's to a lower temperature, those colors are kept intact. So Phil has been creating these like sort of illustrative surfaces with these forms that the forms,
beautiful.
his forms have been really graceful and developed for a while, but then he's creating this different like look and aesthetic with the
Yeah, if you had
surfaces
showed
of
me
them.
that and said they were Phil's, I would have been stumped because I am familiar with earlier work of his. But
Yeah.
boy, those are beautiful.
Yeah, and so he's been working with these series of forms for or that approach for the past year and a half, 2 years, and him and George
That's fantastic.
Him and George McCauley are actually doing a show together, focusing on low wood-fired work next fall in 2017 at the Clay
Excellent.
Studio. So
And
people
then again, this is one of the crossovers from Helena, the Archie Bray, George, Phil,
Yeah.
and this community
Exactly.
in Montana, which is pretty tight-knit
Yeah.
and sharing.
Yeah, and then a lot of artists and residents that come to us have also been residents at the Archie Bray Foundation or have gone there afterwards. So it's really interesting. You see these cross connections because I was there as a resident before I ever came here. Alison Ranches was there as a resident. Cortney Murphy was there as a resident. And then we've sent like residents. Perry Haas is now a resident at the Archie Bray Foundation, and it's like you can actually do 6 years worth of residencies in the state of Montana.
Do we have one more image?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
And so this is a work by Renee Brown. She was an artist, long-term artist in residence, I believe, yes, it was from 2008 to 2010 at the Clay Studio of Missoula. And her work is, well, it's sort of in the same vein as Phil, where there is a transition, but with Renee's, it was a very stark transition. There's her work that she was focusing on as a resident was functional pottery, a lot of colored slips on like a mid-range earthenware forms, and just these very lively functional works. And then near the end of her residencies, she started experimenting with mineral and gem specimen type formations, and then sort of went full-fledged into that, as you can see.
Well, and I think, I've written a little bit about Renee, and these are fantastic sculptural forms, and she's just doing some fantastic work right now. But it's also work from her imagination. I mean, when you look at them, you might imagine that they're from a gem show or something like that.
And that's the thing. It's a mashup between she takes things that and tries to mimic actual mineral specimens, and then makes up different ones that don't exist. And so it's sort of this trick.
Well, and it's stretching the dialogue about clay and ceramic.
And then she's not been shy about using mixed media in these forms. A lot of it's incorporating a lot of crushed glass.
Sure.
She's, in this current body of work, she's using these cut glass pieces that look like facets that have been like sort of placed in there. And sort of experimenting. She comes from a background of being an interior designer, so she's been able to sort of take that skill and the way she sort of approaches things from the interior design aspect, and then apply it to how she composes these forms as well. Because as you know, you've seen them in like sort of larger environments as well, creating a space for these to live in.
Yeah. Well, Shalene, thank you so much. And it's unfortunately we're running out of time here.
Wow.
But want to just thank you for bringing these remarkable artists in, and the Clay Studio for being such an important part of the cultural fabric of Missoula, and that we've hopefully elevated the dialogue a little bit about talking about and feeling more comfortable in talking about these artists. Thank you so much, and that's our program for today.